Thanks for tuning in to Business Daily, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Jung. As always, let's get started with a look at today's highlights. Good news for food trucks here in Korea. Food trucks are given the green light to operate on roads, including pedestrian streets, giving them more spots to do business. Leaders of Korea, China, and Japan got together for the first time in 3 years. What came out of that meeting and what lies ahead for the three neighboring countries? We find out more with an expert. We begin with Korea's consumer prices, which climbed at the fastest pace in 11 months in October. But deflation concerns are still hard to shake off, with numbers rooted in the 0% range. Our Hwang Ji has more.
Korea's consumer prices rose 0.9% in October from a year earlier, marking the fastest growth since November last year. Statistics Korea attributes the pickup to a rise in prices of agricultural goods and public utility rates. The agency adds that the core inflation, which excludes volatile oil and agricultural products, was up 2.3% from a year ago. Still, concerns linger over deflationary risks. While the recovery momentum remains weak, inflation hovers in the 0% range, falling far below the central bank's target band of 2.5% to 3.5%. Korea's stronger than expected third quarter growth was also mainly attributed to government spending, which experts say can only be a short-term cure for the ailing economy facing sluggish global demand, especially from China. The export-driven economy saw its outbound shipments plunge by the biggest margin in over 6 years last month, dropping more than 15% from a year ago. Given that, experts add that it's questionable whether such recovery momentum seen in the third quarter could continue on for a time being. Hwang Ji, Business Daily.
Despite China's slowing economy, Korea's dependence on it for trade has in fact grown. Data from Statistics Korea and the Trade Ministry tell us that China took up 23.2% of Korea's imports and exports in the first 3 quarters of the year, hitting a record high. Now that's up 1.8 percentage points from the same period last year. The accumulated value of exports that went to China through September of this year accounted for an even larger portion at 25.7%. But experts say these higher numbers reflect more on falling shipments to other major trade partners like Japan and the European Union, rather than increased trade to the world's second largest economy. The country's loose monetary policy is here to stay for the time being. This is according to the Bank of Korea's report submitted to the National Assembly, which cited the slow economic recovery rate and low consumer price growth for upholding this policy. The report also said that the central bank will also keep in mind fluctuating general risks in the face of growing uncertainties in the global market. And some variables it plans to monitor include the country's ballooning household debt, the U.S. Fed Reserve's changing monetary policies, and slowing expansion in China and other emerging markets. Meanwhile, the BOK plans to announce its inflation target band for 2016 before the end of this year. Leaders of Korea, China, and Japan held their first joint meeting in over 3 years this past Sunday. And all eyes are on how this meeting will help step up economic cooperation between the three Asian economic giants. Take a look.
The three-way sit-down in Seoul involving President Park Geun-hye, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was the first of its kind since their last meeting in 2012. And one of the fields that took center stage was economic cooperation. The three parties agreed to work towards concluding the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, and a separate trilateral free trade deal. Following the three-way summit was a series of bilateral talks. During President Park's meeting with the Chinese premier, the two sides inked a number of MOUs to enhance their economic partnership. Following that meeting was a sit-down with Prime Minister Abe, during which Japan agreed to give its support to Korea to enter the US-led free trade initiative known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In order for Korea to join the TPP, involving 12 Pacific Rim economies, each member country must agree to opening negotiations with Seoul. Although much was discussed, some experts say there were no surprises from the latest summit, as some of the most contentious issues among the East Asian countries were never put on the table.
And to tell us more about this, we're now joined by Professor Yang Joon from the Catholic University of Korea in the studio with us today. So good to see you, Professor.
Happy to be here.
All right, so let's dive into what progress was made during those summit talks. First, that trilateral summit between Korea, China, and Japan. What would you say that stands out the most in the outcome of this trilateral summit in terms of economic cooperation?
Well, they stayed more on principles rather than concrete details for the most part, at least in the trilateral three-country meetings. They agreed that the Japan, China, along with Korea, should have more integration of their economies, more liberalization of their markets, and more cooperation to achieve these goals. And then they also committed themselves to having a balanced growth, balanced development of economics, environment, and social factors. So they agreed on more of a principle rather than concrete measures.
But then a lot of attention was, of course, on that Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, and a separate free trade deal between the three countries, right?
Right. But I think one of the problems is that they did not set a date for completion of the negotiations, which means that the parties seem to be still have some major issues that they want to work out. What's good about it is they did commit to continuing this type of relationship, but the fact that they did not agree on a date does seem that there's some major problems to be worked out.
All right. Well, in regards to those FTAs, then, would you say that, like you said, not a lot of progress was made because a concrete date didn't really come out. But what else came out of that, though?
Okay. Well, they did reaffirm their commitment to the FTA. So I'm sure that there were a lot of working level meetings trying to work the problems out, and hopefully by the next time we have these trilateral meetings, they'll have all the at least minor details worked out so that the major details can be worked out in these large meetings, major meetings, which is how they usually do these type of FTA negotiations anyway. So they will have, for the RCEP, they will have the 10th meeting in October. For the Korea, China, Japan FTA, they will have 9th meeting in this month, actually. And hopefully the presidents, the leaders will give them a push to try to work out some of the thornier details, and where the areas they have only slight disagreements on, hopefully this will give them impetus to just work it out.
So they did agree to move forward, though, with those two deals?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right. Also, China and Korea bilateral summit. What came out of that?
Okay. Well, there were a lot of memorandums worked out between the two countries. One of the more interesting ones is Memorandum of Understanding on Cooperation for the Manufacturing Industry Innovation 3.0 on the Korean side, which is part of President Park's Creative Economy Plan, and Manufacturing 2025, which is China's plan for having a more innovative economy. So they decide to cooperate on having those plans interact with each other to develop more innovative Asian markets. And then they just agreed on more cooperation for financial markets, for foreign exchange markets, for short-term lending markets, and so on. And then they also agreed to cooperate on the Eurasian initiative. Both Korea and China has been very interested in developing Central Asian region and developing, say, things like transportation, railway networks through those landlocked countries. So they decided to have a lot of cooperation there. And then, maybe not as important but interesting, is that they signed a memorandum of understanding for rice exports and samgyetang exports, the Korean chicken ginseng soup. Before, China did not allow imports of the samgyetang because they were concerned about some of the health standards, and they apparently worked out a way for Korea to export these samgyetang. So maybe it won't be monetarily a lot, but I think it's symbolically interesting and important.
And those shipments could be going out soon. Like
next year, hopefully.
Oh, next year.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then there was that bilateral summit between President Park Geun-hye and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. What came out of that meeting in terms of economic cooperation?
Okay. Well, one of the more interesting ones there is that Japan agreed to provide have job fairs and have some more opportunities for young Koreans to work in Japan. And since Japan right now is an aging economy, I think that will be beneficial to both countries because that will add a lot of young blood to the Japanese economy while giving more opportunities for Korean youngsters who cannot get a job in Korea to work in Japan. Also, another factor is Japan did agree to back Korea's entering the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. We have been concerned a bit about that because, well, Korea has already signed bilateral two-country FTAs with almost all the members of the TPP, but the two exceptions were Mexico and Japan. And especially with Japan, the negotiations for Korea-Japan FTA has been on hold since about 2004, and the Korea-China-Japan FTA has been, as we mentioned before, going very slowly. So there was some concern that perhaps Japan won't be very enthusiastic about having Korea join, because this will be de facto Korea-Japan FTA as part of the TPP. And the fact that Japan will welcome Korea into TPP, I think does present at least one barrier fallen. But then we'll have to look at the details because now Korea has to negotiate with all the TPP partners, including Japan, on exactly what should be open. So we cleared one hurdle, but there's a series of other hurdles left.
But this would definitely help Korea's entry into the deal.
Well, we know that Japan will not oppose, and they seem to be enthusiastic about Korea joining. So at least in principle, Japan does want Korea to enter TPP, and that's, I think, half the battle right there.
All right. So overall, what kind of economic impact do you think this will have on Korea, this trilateral summit and bilateral summits?
Okay. Well, I think they agreed more on principles rather than the mechanics this time around. But it will be helpful to Korea overall. So they did commit to having more integration, more liberalization, and more innovative economy, and more cooperation both with Japan and China on exploring third markets like Central Asia. So I think overall it will be good for the Korean economy, but it did not go into the concrete details as much as I think a lot of people hoped.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight today, Professor.
Thank you.
With weakening demand for its smartphones, Samsung Electronics might end up falling short of its sales target of 200 trillion won, or $176 billion this year. According to local research firm FN Guide, market projections for the tech giant's fourth quarter sales stand at 53 trillion won, which would push annual sales just over the 200 trillion won mark. But analysts still say it's going to be a close call. Much of Samsung's struggle has to do with competition from Apple and up-and-coming Chinese manufacturers. The silver lining is, though, that demand for TVs and smartphones tends to surge toward the end of the year. Samsung Electronics was the first Korean company to achieve the 200 trillion won mark in 2012 after racking up over 100 trillion won from its mobile sector alone. The tech giant hasn't missed a target since, but its sales and operating income have been falling due to sluggish smartphone sales. We're spotting more and more of those food trucks here in Korea that offer a fun way to grab a bite to eat. But more than a year after the government eased regulations for food trucks, operators feel that there's still a long way to go. Our Eunice Kim checks in with these mobile eateries.
A cheap, on-the-go meal option. Popular among the younger crowd, Food trucks, some fancy, host a bevy of food and drink options. But for those running the trucks themselves, it's still an uphill drive.
Relaxed regulations have helped, but it's still very complicated to get into.
지금 이 장사를 접을까 아니면 계속 할까 지금 고민 중이시라고 하네요.
One of the biggest challenges cited is the lack of spots to operate legally. Food trucks were singled out as an example by the Park Geun-hye administration of an economic driver as it pushed out regulatory reforms last year. But more than a year later, the anticipated 6,000 new jobs and $35 million of new added value is still a distant goal. And with interest from local news channels, the government is reacting with promises of more loosening.
You can legally operate food trucks on roads as long as it's safe. Off the top of my head, pedestrian streets would be a possibility.
According to 24-hour news channel YTN, food truck operation at public buildings and museums or galleries have been allowed. Plans are also underway to make way for similar food sales, those via carts, motorcycles, and 포장마차, or food stalls. Most of these makeshift operations are currently not in business within legal boundaries. But as long as they meet stated food safety and hygiene requirements, the understanding is that the government will greenlight and support them. Eunice Kim, Business Daily.
And that wraps it up for today. Tune back tomorrow at the same time, same place for your Business Daily. As always, thanks for watching.